Welcome back. President Trump is on his way back to Washington after a tumultuous 2 days at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, appearing to de-escalate a crisis over Greenland that he largely created. Yesterday, President Trump announcing a framework for a future deal on Greenland and withdrawing his tariffs on 8 European countries that were set to go into effect next month. Now, remember, just this past weekend, President Trump said he would settle for nothing less than, quote, complete and total control of Greenland. But here's what he said today about his so-called deal.
We're getting everything we wanted, total security, total access to everything, have as many bases, have all the equipment that we want.
So what are we talking about, an acquisition of Greenland? Are you going to pay for it? I mean,
we're talking about it. It's really being negotiated now, the details of it, but essentially it's total access.
Now, we should note the U.S. already has expansive and broad military access to Greenland, and it has for decades, going all the way back to 1951, an agreement between the United States and Denmark that gave the U.S. enormous leeway to establish military bases in the territory. Meanwhile, Greenland's prime minister saying today he still does not know the details of this new proposed framework and reiterating that Greenland's sovereignty remains a red line.
In terms of the deal there's been talking about, I don't know what's concrete in that deal either. But I know that we have now a high-level working group working on a solution for both parties. We have said from the beginning in Greenland, we have some red lines. We cannot cross the red lines. We have to respect our territorial integrity.
Before leaving Davos, President Trump also hosting a signing ceremony with leaders joining his Board of Peace, which the president suggested could rival the United Nations. According to the board's charter, President Trump will serve as the inaugural chairman and have veto power over all the board's decisions. Joining me now is NBC News Chief White House Correspondent Peter Alexander in Switzerland and NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons. Peter, I have to start with you. You've been traveling with the president throughout the course of this week. I know you've been talking to your sources. What more are you learning about this framework of a deal on Greenland?
You know, Kristen, what's striking to me is as the president departs, things are not too dissimilar from where they were before he left here. The president, as a Danish senior official told us late today, basically could have had all the elements of this framework that he's discussing for the past many months. That, as you note, dating back to the Cold War, there has been an agreement between the U.S. and Denmark that basically said if the U.S. wanted to build more bases, put more troops on its land, that they were effectively free to do that. Nonetheless, the president ratcheted up the tension and then ultimately backed away on military force, on tariffs, left a lot of people here rattled, angry, frankly, and disappointed, in the words of that official from Denmark, telling us late tonight that, among other things, they believe that the relationship, the transatlantic relationship, has certainly in some ways been damaged by what we've witnessed over the course of the last several days. So what is in this deal right now? NBC News has been reporting, based on two former senior officials, that the president has recently been discussing his desire to put more troops on the ground in Greenland, even before he arrived here, to have more bases there, with the desire that he could use that in part to build this proposed Golden Dome that is still in its planning stages, a missile defense system to protect against Russian attacks, perhaps, in the future. And the New York Times tonight, Kristen, according to 8 senior Western officials, is reporting that one of the discussions in the proposals being talked about privately right now includes the potential that the U.S. might be able to have sovereignty over small pockets of Greenlandic land where some of those U.S. military bases would be in the future.
Well, really remarkable insight from the sources you're talking to there, Peter. I do want to turn to the Board of Peace. Just extraordinary that he's creating this body that some European leaders feel does run counter to the UN. Tell us a little bit about the leadership there of the Board of Peace and what the reaction has been broadly.
Well, let's talk about this as it relates to the United Nations. The president today saying they thought they could work very closely with the United Nations, but you don't need me to tell you how fiercely critical he has been of the UN in the past. And while there have been about 50 invitations sent out to countries, roughly 20 or more countries have said yes today. Among those who have said no, declined this offer from the president, some of America's traditional allies. France and the United Kingdom saying among their concerns are the idea that this could undermine, could compromise the strength of the United Nations. Among those who have been invited, who have yet to accept the offer, Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, and among those in the room that accepted the deal as well, many with authoritarian leaders. You just sort of look around the room, and it was pretty striking today. We saw Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, many other countries there side by side with the president. But the point you said at the top, Kristen, was particularly critical, that the president basically runs the show on this. I was talking to our friend Keir earlier today, and in many ways, this is the I run the world board, in effect, as Keir and I discussed. And look at this, if you want to see how it is a bit similar to the United Nations, side by side. Here's the UN's emblem. Here is the emblem of the new Board of Peace. One, the UN, shows a map of the world. The other, the Board of Peace, presented to you by President Trump, has the U.S. front and center, and it looks like the logo has been dipped in gold.
Just remarkable optics there, Peter. Thank you for showing us that side by side and for all of your great reporting and your long trip there. We really appreciate it. Keir, I want you to start off where Peter left off, which is the Board of Peace. The reaction that you are hearing from the United States allies, international partners, what are people saying?
Well, the UK and France says that it's not going to say that they're not going to join the Board of Peace. European countries are mostly or many saying that they won't join the Board of Peace. You might say that's not surprising given the rift, the ruck that President Trump just had with the Europeans over Greenland. They're probably not in a mood to start supporting his great plan. There's another part to this too, and Peter touched on it, which is just think about this. At the moment, you have a United Nations with a Security Council with permanent members that are Britain and France, as well as Russia and China and the United States. They all have a veto. The Board of Peace, there's only a veto for the chairman, Donald Trump, who can stay as chairman for as long as he likes. And this is according to the charter that they've published, and will decide who the next chairman should be. So why would France and the UK agree to join a body where they no longer have a veto and are working under the US president, unlike at the UN? But that leads me to another interesting, fascinating question, because that's the allies of the United States. But what about the adversaries? Why would President Putin sign up? Certainly, why would President Xi of China sign up to that? They will quickly recognise this as them potentially being layered, as you would say in management speak, a dilution of their authority and of their power. And I suspect in the Kremlin right now, President Putin is trying to weigh up that question, because on the other hand, joining the Board of Peace gives him a platform on the world stage with the United States that he hasn't had since his full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, well, OK, and you take me to my next question, because President Zelensky announcing there's going to be a trilateral meeting between the U.S., Ukraine and Russia tomorrow. Seems significant, Keir. What are you watching for? Could there be some real progress that comes out of this meeting? Well,
I mean, I think there is progress. That trilateral meeting will happen in the United Arab Emirates. And I think it's going to be in Abu Dhabi, and I think it's going to be fascinating. I didn't pick up, from what I've seen reported, whether that will be a face-to-face meeting with the Ukrainians and the Russians, or whether they'll be separate. It's not the first time that they've all been in Abu Dhabi together, so it is progress. It's not a breakthrough. We do have President Zelensky now saying that they have agreed there is now a security agreement with the United States in writing that he has put together with President Trump, which won't be signed until there's a peace deal. But I do think that you are seeing real progress from those negotiations with Ukraine. But the question remains, what is President Putin going to agree to? And Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, President Trump's son-in-law, of course, and his envoy, are in Moscow as we speak, Kristen, talking to President Putin. And it'd be interesting to know what they're hearing from him. Up till now, he has stuck to his maximalist goals.
Well, I know you'll be among the first to get all the details. Keir, as always, thanks for your great reporting. We appreciate it. Great to see you.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or watch live on our YouTube channel.